My three children are at an age that when they fall in love with a movie, they watch it again and again and again and again until the songs in that movie, the characters, the images of that movie are so ingrained in my brain that I begin to go crazy. So the last weeks and months, our children have been watching Annie. Both the 1982 version and the 2014 version, though I would contend the 1982 version is much better. So many of you know the story based on the Broadway play. Orphan Annie is taken in by, in 1982 version, by Daddy Warbucks, this millionaire who brings Orphan Annie into this place of opulence. Our daughters know each song word for word, and they rehearse and perform them daily. A few days ago, I walked back across campus and saw all three of them in our driveway with brooms, even little Francie, 16 months old, brooms walking around in procession in the driveway singing, "It's a hard knock life for us." The deep irony of that, right? This beautiful neighborhood in San Gabriel, California, I stopped and said, "Yeah, it's a hard knock life. Y'all are really suffering." The readings this morning, all three of them are hard knock life for a preacher. These are challenging readings. Our gospel lesson is of Lazarus. It's a parable of Lazarus and this rich man, this Daddy Warbucks, who each day passes by Lazarus, who is poor, who is sick, who is scrambling to eat the scraps of food from the rich man's table. Rich man chooses day by day to ignore the cries, to ignore the pleas. Then fast forward to a time in eternity when this rich man suffers. This chasm, it says, has been placed between he and God. As a person who lives in America, who lives in San Gabriel, California, I am challenged. I am convicted by this parable. And I see this as a parable. Parables are meant to evoke a response. Parables are meant to make us think. This parable makes me think. How do I act when I see people in need? How do I respond? I see this rich man, I see this Daddy Warbucks, if you will, unable to have the courage within himself to look at that self within him who's fearful of not having enough. I think about when I'm not able to be my best self, not able to see someone suffering out of my own fear, out of my own desire to be safe. Now for me, it's often less about money. It's more about often, for me, my children and my children's safety. So let me give you an example. I have permission to share this story of my best friend, Brian, was the best man at my wedding. He is a chef in New York City. We speak daily, and it's never about God. It's usually terrible dad jokes, and we share recipes. and he's just a very funny gentleman. I don't see Brian very often. He is married in New York. I haven't seen him until recently for years, in fact, in person. Brian and his wife, Taryn, had a daughter named Hannah, born about 2.5 years ago. Hannah was born with a liver malfunction. From day one, they knew that Hannah's survival, her life was at risk. And so Hannah, about 1.5 years into her life, had a liver transplant. We prayed very hard for Brian. I spoke to him quite often in that process, and 6 months after that transplant, they really believed that it took. At her second birthday, Brian texted me and he said, "I cannot believe we're celebrating her second birthday." 3 months later, Brian, who never texts me about God, never texts me about anything serious, called me on the phone on a Sunday evening. It was on Easter afternoon, and said, "I need you here. I need you to come to New York." And that's because Hannah was dying. After they had thought that her liver had taken, it then rejected. And I sat with Brian and Taryn in the hospital for 3.5 days, waiting for there to be a recipient of her organs. And I waited and watched and prayed and cried, sitting present with the worst I could imagine for myself. I still talk to Brian multiple times every day. Or I try to. Because I don't always enjoy talking to Brian. Because Brian is not okay. Brian is not all right. Nothing has been fixed about the situation. Most days when I talk to Brian, he shares with me how depressed and frustrated he is. And I, with 3 healthy girls, I want to walk by Brian. I want to keep going on my day, because to talk to Brian is to remind myself of that which I could lose. And yet, talking to Brian, being in relationship with Brian, is to be closer to the holy, to be closer to someone in pain and someone in suffering. Brian is Lazarus for me. To enter into the conversion experience, to be with that which is suffering, particularly suffering in the way you would most fear, is the opportunity for me in our parable this morning. And actually, to go back to the movie Annie, to whatever degree we can say the movie Annie is worthwhile from a moral perspective, the movie Annie is not really about Annie. It's really about Daddy Warbucks and who's ever around Annie and their choice of a conversion experience or not. This parable this morning is about the rich man and not about Lazarus. Whether or not you, me, we have the courage to go towards those who suffer, especially when we fear that same suffering for ourselves, and be open to the holy. Yesterday, I had the great pleasure of attending the Dorris, Dann memorial service, and I was so touched by a person I never had the pleasure to meet. It was a wonderful reflection shared by Jose, who Doris Dann would call Joselito when she wanted him to do something for her. And he wrote this beautiful reflection about Doris Dann. I'm going to read a little bit about it because it is so apropos for me of what this parable is imploring us to do. It says, "When I met Doris, I was only 14 years of age. I would come right after school and hang out with her for almost 2 to 3 hours because I had to wait for my dad to finish volunteering at the food pantry. Sometimes she would help me with my homework, which reminds me that she was probably the worst tutor I ever had. She never had nice things to say when you got the wrong answers or couldn't understand the assignment. Nevertheless, she was always willing to help me. And this is the part I think is just beautiful. There is a Chinese saying that says, if you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. If you want happiness for a day, go fishing. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. If you want happiness for a lifetime, help somebody. If you want happiness for a lifetime, help somebody. I want to believe that Dorris found happiness by helping others. For me, this parable is a challenge and an opportunity to go towards those who suffer, particularly in ways we most fear. May we be more like Dorris. May we follow a Savior who goes towards the suffering, and in doing so, may we be open to a conversion experience.